billion, it misses the point. Because the point of this, and if you listen to what the president said when he launched it, was that there's been a lot of introspection and looking at what ails not just Ghana's economy, but a lot of African economies and a lot of economies in the developing world. And coming to the realization that the way, part of our problem has been the way our economies are structured. The problems are structural. A lot of it are legacies, from colonial times, that we haven't really taken the time to understand and change. So, for me, the point is not whether this would be a boom or a bust for the NDC, but it's an issue of what do we need? We've been going at this, development thing for how many years now? More than 60 years right now.
From Nkrumah's 7-year plan.
Exactly. We haven't made much progress, right? There needs to be a paradigm shift. There needs to be a shift in the way that we think about our development. And this blueprint provides a different way of thinking about development and ensuring that we are able to achieve the levels of job creation and prosperity for our people.
People are thinking about Ghana beyond aid. And it was Ghana not beyond IMF.
Yeah, and that's where then we need to get into the details of it, right? Because critically, the things that we realize are these. Number one was the fact that our economy was structured to be import dependent. And basically was structured as an economy that really was really meant for extraction of raw materials, extraction of resources, right? And so you realize that in terms of our exports, our top exports today are gold, oil, and cocoa, even though cocoa is dwindling. But these contribute 80% or more of our exports. We don't export a lot of value-added products. Even places like Kenya, export a lot more value-added products than we do. And we import everything else, including inputs that we use to producing the things that we even use in this country, right? And in terms of, so if you look at the data...
Including Yemuadie.
Including Yemuadie, right? Yeah. Yemuadie is our second largest, food import.
We spend close to 3 billion Ghana cedis.
Yeah, exactly. In importing Yemuadie. We can't continue like that, right? And if you continue like that, the way this economy is structured, what you end up doing is that even in times when we think we are, and that's part of the problem, because there's been a lot of really good interventions, but because of the siloed nature, because we are not thinking about it in an integrated fashion, looking at all the different value chains that they will impact and how do we support it, we end up sometimes even causing more problems for ourselves when we are trying to do the right thing. So what we are trying to do is take a step back, understand what have we done all these years that hasn't worked. What are the lessons to learn from the different things, the Ghana Beyond Aid, 1D, 1F, all of those things? What are the lessons that we learn from it? And how do we do it differently to ensure that we actually...
Are we ever learning any lessons?
Well, hopefully this...
Even in the housing sector, everybody comes and says affordable housing. They won't finish. Another one comes. Instead of completing what was left...
That's why you don't...
Instead of completing what was left, you start a new one and then start prosecuting people over the old one. And the old one is rusting, getting damaged. We don't finish it. As we speak now, there is prosecution of Collins Dada and the rest, right? That was which was ongoing, which has now been terminated. I said the last time I remember, and that project was not followed through, and we're losing all the money we sunk into it. It's becoming even more expensive, to deal with it. Tell us what is going to be different. What are the lessons you have learned at the Secretariat, led by Guzitano, to model something that is different from all that we have seen, including the Ghana Beyond Aid?
Okay. So, in terms of the way we've approached this, right, our strategy has been, one, let's identify which sectors are the prime for us to focus on. Which value chains are most important for us, right? Because you can't do everything at the same time. You talk to so many people, you come up with, but you can't do everything at the same time. And then let's identify what are the constraints within these value chains and how do we ensure we remove these value chains. The whole objective there is to ensure that we are building integrated value chains in order to, one, increase input self-reliance. Okay, we produce more of what we need and then be able to generate the surpluses to be able to export. We want to increase resilience so that when there are shocks within the global supply chains, we are not as significantly impacted as we are today. Today, if there's any shock within the global supply chains, Ghana is one of those that gets affected the most. That's why, for instance, in the last administration, you heard a lot about Russia, Ukraine, okay? And there were all sorts of, issues around Russia, Ukraine. We want to be able to change that. And we also want to get to the stage where we are making optimal use of the resources that are available to us, okay? So one of the things that you actually even realized, so we looked extensively at 1D, 1F and what worked and what didn't work. And one of the things that you realize with 1D, 1F, for instance, is that it was broad in the areas it had to be narrow and narrow in the areas that it had to be broad.
Explain that.
And I'll explain that. So 1D, 1F was essentially couched as a manufacturing intervention. So, and in that sense, it was too narrow because you can't just grow manufacturing without thinking about the full value chain. Because if you start, for instance, if you look at agro-processing, the problem with agro-processing in this country, the biggest problem with agro-processing, they'll tell you, is inputs. We don't get the raw materials that we need to be able to produce. I'm told that we get only about 30% of the raw materials that we need for agro-processing from Ghana. Okay. If you want to solve that problem, if you want to get into agro-processing and improve agro-processing, you need to look at the full value chain. You need to understand where is the primary production being done that feeds into this. How are you getting the equipment, the machinery and things that you need to be able to do that? So in that sense, 1D, 1F tackled the problem very narrowly, looking at just manufacturing. Now, it was broad in the area where it had to be narrow in the sense that it did not then focus on which places do we have the competitive advantage for manufacturing that we focus on. And so it was just left broadly. So anywhere you go, anything you want to do becomes part of it. That you spread yourself too thin, right? Those are some of the lessons that we've learned that you see actually getting into
By reading your document, you are simply out there to incentivize businesses to grow the economy. That's all you're going to do, and you're going to do it by, giving them some exemptions, tax exemptions, no import duty. It's the same thing, 1D, 1F was doing. As for electricity consumption, you said if corporate and income tax rebates, you spoke about that as well. If you are doing 2 shifts, you get 25% rebate. If you are doing 3 shifts, you get 50% rebate, and so on and so forth. What else is different? Okay,
so there are a number of things that are different in this instance. So you talk about the, I've told you one about the fact that this is, we are adopting an integrated value chain approach. We selected very specific value chains in which we need to focus in. 1D, 1F, you didn't have that. The other thing, you talk about incentives. We've looked at the incentive regime in this country, taking a look at all the laws and how, people, you realize that there is so much discretion that's given to the bureaucracy. Too much discretion to the extent. So you can be doing the same thing. I could be doing the same thing as Prof. I'll get all the tax incentives and Prof will not get anything just because I know somebody and he doesn't know someone. So if you look at part of what we are proposing is that incentives should not be, left to discretion of bureaucrats or politicians. Incentives should be based on performance and based on what it is, what are the priorities of the government. Okay, so what is the country's priorities and how do you do it? So that's one of the very, and this is significant.
So if it will not be left to politicians or bureaucrats, as you said, who is going to be making this decision so that there will not be the discrimination you speak about?
There needs to be clarity. So for instance, if we've identified oil palm as a strategic value chain that we want to develop, and we say if you are bringing in equipment that is related to oil palm, you get incentives. This should be clearly spelled out so that if I get to Tema and I'm bringing something that impacts on the oil palm value chain, the guy at the port should be able to make that decision and move. I don't need to now apply to the minister for the minister to provide the exemptions, and then it goes to the GRA commissioner for the GRA commissioner to do this. I don't need to do all of that. Okay, so that's part of what, so when you say it needs to be very clear, and I need to know that I'm getting this even before I come in. Because in today's regime, you don't know what you're getting until you come in. You come in, you write a letter and hope that it is approved before you get in. Those are some of the things that...
Some of the processes of the exemptions are actually unconstitutional, we contend. And I have been in court, in the Supreme Court,
that's good,
leading 3 MPs
that's
to
great.
Challenge the manner in which the 1D, 1F, exemptions were being dished out. And it's the problem you have actually mentioned.
Exactly.
Because eventually we are sort of channeling money to party people and not really interested in building, companies that will last and provide the jobs.
Exactly. So that's part of what we are. The other thing that we are doing that's very significant, and I'm sure is the Volta Economic Corridor that we are looking at. And this is a vast resource that we haven't taken much advantage of. Now, when you look at it, and when I started, I was talking about the fact that much of our problems and much of what we are doing today is steeped in the thinking from colonial days. Okay. For example, if you think of agric, for instance, almost every person you meet today who is into agric is looking at exports, not looking at feeding the country. But you need to first achieve food sovereignty, food sustainability before you even think about exporting what you have. So you go into the, how do you call it? We're having some conversations with the rubber industry recently, and rubber manufacturers in this country cannot get the rubber to process, and yet we are exporting the rubber. That's what actually led to the TCDA sending out the directive that we need to satisfy local, demand before we actually think about export. Within the Volta economy, so that's one of the colonial thinking. The other problem also has been, if you look at the development of infrastructure in this country, you realize much infrastructure is developed on the western side. So, most of the railways and the roads are more on the western side because that's where a lot of the resources were. So if you think about the bauxite, the gold and everything, it was either inland or to the west. And that's why you see all of this built over there. You don't see a lot of that in the eastern side of the country. And then we had this Akosombo Dam and this huge river, this huge lake, got created. The lake is, pardon? But that's what I said.
You said huge lake God created.
No, got created.
Oh, sorry. Then I heard you. I just needed to correct that for the record's sake. Maybe other people heard so.
Okay, all right.
Correct.
I didn't say God created it.
Yeah,
it's the biggest man-made lake in the world.
Thank you. That's what I mean.
That's it. And you have so much land over it. We've visited it. We've traversed. And what you realize, the place is in terms of population density, very low population density. Much of the agriculture you see there is actually not irrigated agriculture, but they are right by the lake and they are farming, and it's all based on rain, when you have that water running over. And you ask yourself, why are we not developing this place? The response that you get is that, well, to develop it is too expensive to build the roads to access those places. And so we focus on developing the parts where the roads are already built rather than focus on building the place where the roads are not. And that's a fair concern, because I actually, in looking at this, we reviewed one project that was done in the Afram Plains area. And almost 50% of the costs was actually the construction of the road. Okay. So it's expensive to build roads, but you have the river there, and the river can be the road. So the concept here is let's rethink the way we think about development around that area. Let's think about the river as the road. If you think of the river as the road, then you can open up the place. You can build the agroecological parks, which depend on the water for irrigation. So you are no more farming once a year, you are farming twice a year or 3 times a year in sometimes. And then build the factories that support basically agro-processing and taking it.
Okay.
It's not the same thing as 1D1F.
So
we can talk about it.
So you hold on now. I wanted you to open, and then my other guests will come in, and you will have the opportunity to make corrections or interventions as may be necessary. You are